Richmond, everybody's favourite detective and the self-professed best private eye in Rabbit Town. As with many characters in the games, nothing is revealed of his backstory during the game itself, and all that many fans may know about him is that he's a self-styled hard-boiled detective. While the game revealed nothing of Richmond's backstory, his backstory was explored in a short story titled Lavender Village Murder Case, which was included in the Genso Suikoden short story collection 4, a book that released in Japan in June 2002, 3.5 years after the game released. This short story covered Richmond's big break as a detective and how he met his cat Bianca. The story played out like one of those old murder mystery shows, and it's one of the more interesting short stories. It's also one of the longer short stories, coming in at over 40 pages, which is around twice as long as most, so for the sake of time I may have to gloss over some of the unimportant parts. The story takes place during the events of the Gate Rune War, around the time the South Window and Tinto forces invaded the Senon region of the Scarlet Moon Empire. The story begins as Richmond arrives in Rabbit Town on a stagecoach. Later that evening, as Richmond was strolling along the outskirts of the town, he heard a man scream in the distance. Richmond could spot a light burning within the forest, coming from the same direction as the scream, and rushed towards it, where he found the Lavender Village Inn. Richmond ran inside and found several men in the dining area near the bar. He asked them if they heard a scream just now, and they informed him that it came from the second floor and that the innkeeper went up to check it out. At the same time the men were answering Richmond, he heard a woman's scream coming from the second floor. Richmond then rushed up the stairs and spotted an open door at the end of the hallway. Entering the room, Richmond could see a silver-haired man in his mid-40s lying unconscious on the bed, his nightgown covered in blood and cut apart as if slashed by a knife. A woman called Rose was standing beside the bed, crying out the name Milan, Milan, while the innkeeper was in a state of panic, pacing back and forth in a confused manner with his head in his hands. Not believing that the man was dead, Richmond yelled at the innkeeper to find a doctor, who then snapped out of his panic and sprinted out of the inn in search of a doctor. Richmond then began tearing up blankets to stem the bleeding while asking Rose if she had any medicinal plants to treat the man's wounds. Richmond spotted several wounds on the man's side, as if he had been slashed over and over again. The cuts were so bad that he could see the man's ribs through the flow of blood. Rose then began to cry, asking Richmond if her husband was going to be okay. The innkeeper soon returned with a doctor who managed to stop the bleeding and patch up the man's wounds. The doctor then informed them that the man had lost a lot of blood and that it will be some time before he regains consciousness. He then handed Rose some medicine with instructions to give it to her husband every morning and evening with water. With the man's life now saved, Richmond would set his focus on investigating the attempt on his life and began questioning the innkeeper and Rose about the incident. Rose informed Richmond that her husband Milan was alone in the room at the time and that the door was locked as he liked to shower before dinner, while the innkeeper told him that he and Rose were downstairs in the dining room at the time the incident occurred, and that Milan was in the state he was in when they entered the room using the spare key. Richmond ruled them both out as suspects because of their aid in saving Milan's life, but he couldn't help but sense that Rose was hiding something from him. The innkeeper then asked Richmond who he was, and Richmond revealed that he was a private detective from South Window City and that he'd be happy to investigate the crime in exchange for payment. The innkeeper initially rejected Richmond's offer and insisted that they'd go to the local public order department for help, as he found Richmond's appearance to be quite shady. But Richmond managed to convince Rose to hire him for the job. Richmond then instructed the innkeeper to assemble everyone in the inn for questioning, and as the innkeeper was rounding up all of the guests, Richmond scanned the room for clues. Locked door, locked windows, and the room in perfect order with nothing broken, nothing out of place, and nothing appearing to have been stolen. Given the state of the room, Richmond ruled out theft and assumed that it must be a case of attempted murder and that the perpetrator must have been acquainted with Milan. He then started questioning Rose about herself and Milan, asking why they were travelling and how long they'd been staying here. Rose answered Richmond's questions, stating that Milan was a kind person, that they made a small sum of money from farming and decided to do some travelling, and that they arrived at the inn only 4 days ago. Something Rose said had stuck with Richmond. He couldn't get past the remark she made about only being here for 4 days. Even though he could sense she was hiding something, Richmond felt that Rose was a good person and he believed her about Milan being a kind soul. This had Richmond asking himself, what kind of conflict could have happened in the last 4 days to make someone want to kill such kind people? The case left Richmond baffled. 2 middle-aged farmers who were only passing through, a locked room, the absence of a weapon, and an unknown assailant with an unknown motive. The innkeeper then informed Richmond that all of the guests had been assembled in the dining area. As Richmond made his way down to the dining hall, he realised there was no evidence and that his interrogations would have to be harsh. As he entered the dining room, Richmond could spot 6 men. Some of the men looked around the room anxiously, while others were unbothered as if this was none of their business. Richmond asked the innkeeper, "Is this everyone?" To which the innkeeper replied, "These were the only people who were in the inn at the time. Other than them, only the maid isn't present. But she went shopping before the incident occurred and hasn't come back yet, that she's probably still gossiping with the lady next door." Richmond then informs all of the patrons what happened to Milan and then asks the innkeeper, whose name was Glidden, to introduce him to the guests. Glidden introduced the 6 men to Richmond. Santos, a regular at the inn who worked at the docks loading and unloading cargo, had an alibi and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Miguel, another frequent patron of the inn, had an alibi as he was audibly playing with his glass at the time of the incident and was also ruled out as a suspect. A third unnamed guest also had an alibi and was ruled out. This left 3 people who had no alibi. Dogu, a suspicious-looking swordsman who kept his face covered with a bandana. Bolans, a trader, and an unnamed woodcutter. As Richmond prepared to interrogate them, he asked the room, "Is there anyone here who is acquainted with Milan?" Only those with alibis raised their hands, and of the 3 without alibis, Dogu and Bolans began to look nervous. Dogu insisted he doesn't know Milan, has never spoken to him, and had nothing to do with what happened. The innkeeper Glidden then chimed in, stating that while Dogu may not have spoken to Milan, when Milan entered the dining hall yesterday, Dogu was glaring at him from across the room. The unnamed woodcutter then interrupted, stating that while Dogu was drinking alone at the bar, he wandered off shortly before the scream and hurried back shortly after. Dogu then stood up, reaching for his sword and threatening the woodcutter. Richmond calmed things down and took Dogu into an empty room for interrogation. Dogu insisted he was only outside to get some fresh air. Richmond then inspected Dogu's sword, which showed great signs of use as it was full of nicks and dents, but there were no signs of blood. Dogu then took out several throwing knives from under his coat, but Richmond wouldn't press him on the matter. Next up, Richmond questioned the trader Bolans. Richmond asked him what he was doing during the time of the incident, and Bolans replied that he thought it was a robbery, so he locked himself in his room and tried to hide his valuables. Richmond then questioned him about Milan, to which Bolans replied that he attempted to purchase an item from Milan but was rejected. Based on their conversation, Richmond got the impression that Bolans cared more for money and material wealth than human life. Richmond would now suspect both Dogu and Bolans of the attempted murder. Dogu had the weapons and the skills, but Bolans had the motive. Richmond then headed back to Milan's room to search for clues, but on his way back he heard a sound near the back door. There he found a young girl in her mid-teens sitting on the doorstep and petting a kitten. Richmond introduced himself to her and the 2 spoke about cats for a short time. The girl then told Richmond that her name was real and that she worked at the inn as a maid. Richmond tried to question her about the incident but was soon interrupted by a woman called May, who was the wife of Glidden. May informed Richmond that Real was a nice girl and that she used to live in a village near the border, but 5 years ago the Scarlet Moon Empire attacked her village and burned it to the ground. Her entire family was killed in the attack and May and Glidden took her in and raised her as their own. May, realizing she was reminding Riel of a terrible memory, quickly apologized as Riel went back inside the inn. May then asked Richmond if there were any suspects, and he told her about Dogu the swordsman and Bolan the trader. May then commented that she always thought they were dodgy and that they both seemed very interested in Milan's sword. Richmond finally had his first clue in the case: Milan's sword. May then told Richmond a story of how Milan was drinking unusually heavily a couple of nights ago, but that he wouldn't talk about what was bothering him. Then Bolans, who had checked into the inn that same night, sat beside Milan at the bar and attempted to purchase the sword from him. May mentions that Milan looked down at his sword with disgust before refusing Bolan's offer. May then described the sword to Richmond, stating that it was such a splendid sword that if sold, it could probably buy a mansion. Richmond began to wonder, what could a farmer possibly be doing with a sword like this? Richmond then asks May about Dogu, and May informs him that Dogu was also at the bar that night, but that he looked panicked when he spotted the sword before quickly leaving the bar. Richmond once again began asking May about Riel and how she got along with Milan and Rose. May answers that when she told Milan and Rose about what happened to Riel's parents, their eyes welled with tears of sympathy and they smothered Riel with affection. Richmond then left to speak with Rose in the hopes of inspecting Milan's sword. Just as May said, Milan's sword was something special. The scabbard was decorated with a gold dragon soaring towards the hilt. The hilt also had a gold dragon carved into it, decorated by 7 coloured gems. The inscription on the blade read, 7 Treasure Rising Dragon, but the sword was covered in rust, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. Rose told Richmond that Milan hated swords, but he brought it with him for self-defense. Richmond couldn't help but notice the expression on Rose's face. The secret he felt she was keeping from him earlier. He now believes it's connected to this sword. Richmond then left with the sword with the intent of questioning Bolans, and after questioning Bolans, Richmond realised that his story was straight and that he had attempted and failed to buy the sword from Milan. Richmond then set his sights on Dogu. Richmond entered Dogu's room without knocking, trying to catch him by surprise, but Dogu once again insisted he had nothing to do with what happened to Milan. Richmond pressed the matter, opening the hem of his coat and revealing Milan's sword. Richmond then began to quiz Dogu about the sword, but Dogu would insist his only interest in the sword was as a swordsman, and the only reason he was staring at Milan at the bar was because he wanted to hold the sword. Richmond, realising he was getting nowhere and suspicious of how and why 2 farmers had such an exquisite sword, would come to the conclusion that the secret to solving the case must be the sword itself. Richmond then informed Glidden that he was heading into town to meet with the appraiser Lebrant. A few moments after leaving the inn, Richmond felt something graze his ear, followed by 2 dull shocks in the back. He ducked for cover behind a nearby gate as he heard the clanging of 2 more throwing knives. Richmond immediately knew it was Dogu and taunted him, stating that his coat was made from the leather of a buffalo from the grasslands and that his knives wouldn't be able to cut through the thickness of the leather. He then picked up one of Dogu's knives and threw it back at Dogu, who then fled back inside the inn. Richmond then made his way to Lebrant's appraisal store. Lebrant began inspecting the sword and revealed that the golden dragon that's rising to the hilt symbolises a golden dragon rising to the sky, which is a symbol of the Scarlet Moon Empire. He reveals that swords like this are given to the Empire's most loyal subjects, and upon closer inspection, a sword of this design and quality has only ever been given out once before, 3 generations ago to a nobleman called Duma Fiori. On his way back to the inn, Richmond began piecing it all together. The sword, Rose's expressions, the secret he felt she kept, her willingness to allow Richmond to investigate the attempt on her husband's life instead of local authorities. Richmond had finally found his motive. The attempt on Milan's life was revenge. Revenge against the Scarlet Moon Empire for the many crimes committed against the people of South Window. Richmond then remembered what Dogu told him about Milan's sword. I wanted to hold it. Past tense, not I want to hold it. Richmond realised that Dogu had seen that sword before. meaning that he was from the Scarlet Moon Empire. Richmond then rushed back to the inn, fearing what might happen. As he rushed through the door of the inn, Richmond spotted Riel with a dagger in her trembling hand, as Rose, Glidden, May and Bolan were all standing behind her, and Dogu was standing in front of her with his sword drawn. Dogu's face was no longer covered by his bandana, and a fresh bruise and cut were visible on his face. Richmond finally pieced it all together and realized the truth. It was Riel who attempted to kill Milan. Richmond showed her the sword and she burst into tears, shouting that she'll never forget that sword. The officer who led the attack on her village held that sword and she spotted it as she fled to hide in the nearby forest. May interjected, declaring she doesn't believe Riel, that it can't be true because she was so fond of Milan and Rose and that they adored her. Tears falling from her eyes, Riel says she had a feeling she'd seen Milan before, and when she spotted the sword in Milan's closet while she was cleaning his room, she knew exactly who he was. Riel pretended that the collar of Milan's gown had come loose, and she stitched a shredding wind scroll into his nightgown, which she activated from a distance, and that is how she attempted to take his life. Riel dropped to the floor in tears, and as Rose approached her, she too would drop to the floor with her eyes filled with tears. Suddenly, Dogu burst into laughter, making fun of Richmond for being such a poor detective and declaring his innocence. But Riel cut him off, pointing her dagger at him and shouting he was the soldier who killed her parents. She hadn't noticed earlier because his face was always covered with the bandana, but when he returned to the inn a short while ago, he took it off and she'd never forget that face. The knife Richmond had thrown earlier had cut Dogu's bandana. Dogu came clean that he was a soldier in Milan's unit when they attacked the village 5 years ago, but dismissed the actions as that of war. Richmond saw the look in Riel's eyes. She wanted revenge for the deaths of her family, for the deaths of her friends and everyone in her village. Richmond tried to talk her down, but Dogu now had a bloodthirsty look in his eyes. Dogu had deserted the Imperial Army due to the growing strength of the Liberation Army and feared that Milan had been sent to hunt him down. Dogu was now threatening to kill everybody in the inn to keep his identity a secret. Richmond, who had no training in swordsmanship, pulled out the 7 Treasure Rising Dragon sword, but it was knocked from his hands and flew towards the stairs. Everyone was now terrified, and Bolans attempted to bargain for his life, promising to pay Dogu whatever he wants. Dogu grinned, insisting that it would be easier for him to simply kill everyone and then take whatever he wants. As Dogu approached closer, Riel leapt up beside Richmond with her dagger, declaring she won't allow Dogu to kill Glidden and May. But just as Dogu was about to strike her down, the 7 Treasure Rising Dragon sword flew from the staircase, piercing Dogu's body. Milan, who had finally awoken, was leaning against the wall by the stairs, but the force of throwing the sword at Dogu reopened his wounds and caused him to collapse. Rose rushed to his side, asking if he was okay, but Milan replied, "Rather than me, how is Riel?" Milan's identity finally revealed. He was Milan Fiore. Milan apologized for his role in attacking Riel's village, which is now revealed to be Lalse's village. Riel told him to shut up, not wanting to hear what he had to say, insisting that it's too late to apologize because her parents are already dead. But Milan continued to explain. After the raid on Lalse's village, he retired from military service. He believed he was fighting for the Empire and for the honor of his family, the Fiore family. But after being ordered to slaughter a village of unarmed civilians, he questioned if that was true and then retired from military service. He revealed that he left the Empire to atone for his sins, that he hasn't polished his sword since that day, and has always carried it as a reminder of what he had done. He told Riel that he wasn't asking for her forgiveness and would hold no grudge against her should she seek revenge for the death of her family to end her grief. Riel chose not to take Milan's life, and Richmond yelled at Glidden to get a doctor. 4 days later, keeping Milan's true identity a secret and keeping up his disguise as a travelling farmer, Glidden informed the Public Order Department that Dogu was responsible for the attempt on Milan's life, and that Milan saved them all. Following the events that occurred, Riel decided to leave the inn because of the troubles she felt she caused everyone without saying any goodbyes, except for Richmond, whom she asked to look after her kitten. Riel then got aboard a ship that was sailing south to the island nations as she waved goodbye to Richmond. Richmond then named this kitten Bianca. And that's it for Richmond's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled Lavender Village Murder Case from the Genso Suikoden short story collection 4 that released in Japan in June 2002. It's quite a long story, and I did skim and gloss over parts of it because if I didn't, this easily could have been 30 or 40 minutes long. I initially planned for this to be around 5 to 10 minutes long, but that would have skipped too much of the story and I don't think it would have done the story justice, so I think 20 minutes is the sweet spot for this one. I think it's one of the more enjoyable short stories and I'd highly recommend everybody read it. But as always, do keep in mind that the games, the manga, the novels, the short stories, the anime, and everything else are all separate entities that are written by different authors. The backstory told in this short story is technically not canon to the game, but unless Richmond makes another appearance in a future game, and that game contradicts the information in this short story, then we can treat this as his canon backstory. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.